Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Postal Roads are there. Tonight, just before we go any further, during the week, you may have seen in the Tallaght on Holy Thursday, below the unity flag of Tallaght was raised above the dragon in the centre of Tallaght village. It was a very great occasion down there. It was well covered by the Echo, and on foot of that we received a wonderful letter from Mr. Tallaght himself, Charlie O'Connor. So we got a letter here dated the 3rd of April. Dear Anne, I wish to refer to the flag raising ceremony last Thursday morning and thank you for involving me. I applaud the creation of the unity flag of Tallaght and congratulate all concerned. The initiative by the Tallaght Historical Society in adopting the flag is certainly welcomed. Indeed, I do hope that the positive message of the flag becomes known throughout the region. May I also take this opportunity to wish you continued success with your great endeavours, and I remain available to hear from you and your colleagues anytime you feel I may be of assistance. So that was just a wonderful little occasion there last week in Tallaght Village. I have to say, you look gorgeous in the newspaper, the whole lot. It is fantastic altogether. Wonderful reaction to it. We have, if you just put your mobile phones, must do it on my own, put it onto silent, don't be annoying John here, or he'll show us the road. On a sad note, just to announce that one of the co-founders of the Tallaght Historical Society, Pat O'Neill, passed away at the weekend, and we send our condolences and we're thinking of the family at this moment in time. And without further ado, now this lecture tonight is on the ancient roads of Ireland. It's not potholes, as somebody asked me outside. And without further ado, here's the man to fill you all in. That's the last bit of clapping we'll have tonight, I promise you. The story of roads in Ireland. I wasn't sure how to get this going, so I decided, in these days, we head off regularly in our cars and bicycles and buses and airplanes for all forms of transport. So I decided for a couple of quick slides early on to show you the joys of transport today. And this is one of the tools I use. And as 9:30 last night, I took a couple of screenshots. The first one is of Sydney at 5:30 in the morning. And there's only a little bit of traffic problems. People starting to come in on the lower highway, heading into central Sydney. My son, who used to live over in Bondi, you can see North Bondi over on the right hand side. But in the last, whatever it is, 9 or 10 months, he moved way up, maybe 3 hours north of Sydney. He would take, generally speaking, an hour to get from North Bondi there into Sydney when he's going into work about 9 o'clock. He went by motorbike, and he's colourblind as far as lights and signals are concerned. That's a family issue, okay? At the same time, if I was to look at Google Maps on Moscow, the centre of Moscow is nice and quiet, people have gone home, sipping their vodka or whatever. But the large motorway circle, there's actually 2 motorway circles around Moscow. The main airport is northwest of this. You can see there's a couple of glitches on the motorway, so the chances are that that's motorway repairs. Otherwise, Moscow is quiet. Now, the map of London, those of you who travel to family over in London like I do on a regular basis will know that you never get a clean run if you're doing a reasonable amount of distance in London. So at 8:30 last night, that was the situation. Lots of orange, the odd splotter of red. But really, it's rarely in London that you get a straight run anymore. Certainly very difficult. Well, you can see what's happening to Long Island. But it's only 3:30 in the afternoon. You can imagine if you were heading for Kennedy Airport at say 5 o'clock, you finish your business and you're trying to head out. You can see that all the links heading down towards Kennedy are absolutely red. And they're going to be like that for the next 4 hours. 3, 4, 7, probably 5 hours. But with something like Google Maps, you can say, get me from A to B. It'll give you a calculation of time. It'll give alternative routes if you want them. And you can go. I thought just for fun, I'd stick in what happens with airplanes. And again, the same time last night. And the cluster of blue here are the Middle Eastern airports, Dubai, Abu Dhabi and Doha, and a few of the others. And you can see the long haul flights streaming down from Europe to go into the Middle East, and then other ones streaming down that would head off towards India and Australia, New Zealand and the rest of it. And you can click on any of these planes and it'll tell you what plane it is, where it's coming from, where it's going to go, what height it's at, what speed it's doing, and it'll give you down to the minute when it's due to land. It's another tool I use a bit. This tool I don't use. Again, the same time last night. Traffic on sea. You can track any cargo ships, container ships, passenger ships, whatever, at sea. And if you look over towards Germany, you can see the cargo ships down the rivers. And again, you can click on them. And you can find out what's the ship, where's it going from, where's it going to, what way the cargo it's carrying. So that's technology. But, sorry, the channel. Well, the reason I put that one up was you can see what the queue is like at the channel. We used to take family holidays from Dover across to France, and you'd look around and you might see 5. And you'd say, oh gosh, is that busy or is that light? Just take a look at that map and you know how busy the channel is and why they need highways.
Not a single bit of traffic on an Irish waterway.
Not internally within Ireland, no, not at all. Fair bit going up the Wexford heading for Dublin. The last ice age finished about 12,000 years ago. It took another 2,000 years before our first humans arrived. And there wasn't very many of them. And unlike England, where people walked from France across to England because the melting ices had not flooded that part of what's called Doggerbank at that stage, so people and animals could walk across. And they did. And they could do it easily. But in Ireland it was different. They had to arrive by water. And when you look for this in an Irish context, you find very small clusters of humans who are nomads. They followed the food. And in the early 2,000 years, 3,000 years that they were here, most of that food was fish. A nice proportion of what they ate as their diet was fish, followed by berries, followed by things today we call vegetables. But whether they called them anything or not, I don't know. They only travelled on water because Ireland was forested. And the centre of Ireland was bog and forested. So the remnants, and you can see the dots in the bottom right hand corner, are few and far between. But the primary cluster is up in Northern Ireland, particularly on the River Bann, and the most significant ones are down in the Foyle near Derry. So the two main locations are Mount Sandal, and the second one is Lough Boora. I'd say a whole lot of you have been to Lough Boora. I don't know if any, like I did, asked, where the hell's the lake? There is no lake. Because the water that was the constituent lake has since gone. Two things have happened. The melting ice is no longer melting and affecting Ireland the way it did. And the pressure that was on the land from the weight of the ice has receded, and the land is generally rising every year. It is bouncing back from the weight of that ice that was there 12,000 years ago and continues to do it today geologically. So Lough Boora was a lake and it was attached to what today we would have called the River Shannon. And the remnants they found there of people who cooked, they had fire so they cooked, and fish, and a few very small animal bones. At this stage in Ireland we had only small animals. Everything else had to come in gradually. That changed with the introduction of farming. Farming was a huge change to Ireland, and there's lists and lists and lists of changes that are brought. The primary lists are people settled down and stopped being nomads. And in settling down, they started to build what today we call settlements. And in those settlements, they tended to have one generation living beside another generation. In the previous slide, the maximum age of a man was about 42. The maximum age of a woman was about 45. So generational knowledge, the knowledge we take for granted today, from granny to parents to children, didn't exist in the Mesolithic, but did start in the Neolithic. With farming came wealth. They worked out how to set enough seed to grow for themselves and have a little left over that they could sow for next year. So they had wealth, and that could be traded. So if you had corn, you could trade that for spuds. Not that they had spuds at the time. But in essence, you now have the formation of trade. So things that got traded were animal hides for food, or berries, or fruit. They started to appear in their diet. Because there were clusters of people in settlements, you start to see the evidence of leaders. You start to see the evidence of the first religions. And that's prominent in the way we started to build monuments, primarily monuments to the dead, whether it's Newgrange, Carrickey, or the rest of them. Now, you couldn't build monuments like Newgrange if you were moving every couple of weeks to follow the food as you did in the Mesolithic. You couldn't organise the labour force that was required to build Newgrange if people were on the move all the time. And most of that work was done in winter time. And you had to shift material. If you look at the mound in Newgrange, where did that material come from? The crystallised type rocks on the front of Newgrange came from County Down. There wasn't the M1 and a couple of haulage dumper trucks to bring it down. The big slabs around Newgrange that are engraved on came from Wicklow. How did these rocks travel? They had to come by sea. They had to be put on barges and dragged up the coast. And someday somebody will be doing a dive outside Lambay Island and find a dirty big rock and say, I wonder how that got there. Maybe it just didn't make it. Certainly they had boats. And this is the famous Lurgan boat that's in the National Museum. It's extremely long. Why is it called Lurgan when it was found in a bog in Galway? Because the townland is called, well done, the townland is called Lurgan. And down the right hand side you see one of the ways people made a boat out of a lump of a tree. They scooped out the centre or burnt out the centre, and that's how they made the log boats. And there's a sample on the top right hand corner that looks very like the picture on the bottom right hand corner. So we had the big ones that were obviously big river boats. Could that Lurgan boat have gone from Holyhead to Dalkey, Holyhead to Lambay? Maybe it could. I wouldn't go on it. But also, they had river boats. Bottom right hand, the bottom one in the middle. In recent times, we started to find a lot of these. Is it 8 years ago? They found the first set of them in the Shannon River as they were investigating the wooden bridge that was built across the Shannon. And these were workmen's boats who were working on the building of the bridge. Quite recently, they found another cluster of them in Lough Corrib. These are easy to find. What they do is they tow a radar scanner behind a motorboat. It scans the bottom of the lake or the river, and when it comes across an anomaly, then a diver goes down and finds out what it is. And they're able to date these, take a core from it and do dendroanalysis on the core itself. So really, in the early days of the Mesolithic, they wouldn't have had roads. What they would have had are animal tracks, and they followed the animal if they wanted to catch it and kill it. When we get to the Neolithic, then things change. If you're building something like Newgrange, you do need pathways. You do need carts. You need to be able to bring stuff, mainly clay and scraws and small stones, along with the big stones that you can haul up the Boyne. So, from way back, we know that they were using rivers extensively. And surprisingly enough, the majority of the rivers in Ireland were given female names, primarily the names of goddesses. So the Shannon is called after a goddess, Shannon. and the Boyne is called after a lady called Bovinda, Bo being cow and Vinda being fuel for a cow. In putting the presentation together, there isn't really much research done. There's elements of it in bits, but nothing has done a comprehensive study of ancient roads to today. And I'll go through some of the books that I picked up on the library as I came through this evening, just to show you. I've got details on most of that slide later on, so we won't spend any time on it. When Christianity arrived in Ireland, massive motorways had been built right across Europe, courtesy of the Roman Emperor. So if the Roman Emperor wanted to leave his hacienda in downtown Rome, get on the Appia and arrive in Chester, he went by motorway the whole way. Now in general, if he had a chariot and a couple of horses, he might get 30 miles a day, but he could do it. We had nothing at all equivalent in Ireland at that time. And because we never had a Roman presence in Ireland, a full Roman presence, we never developed in the same way and at the same time. But Christianity arrived in Ireland, and around that time, around the year 500 AD, the Roman Empire collapsed. And they forgot how to build roads in Europe. And they stayed that way for almost 1,000 years. Now, we didn't do much in between, but in essence, the value of the Roman roads that were developed across Europe died at that point. But we had a miracle. When Con of the 100 Battles was born, suddenly, the next morning, we had 5 major roads coming out of Tallaght. So say the Annals of the Four Masters, for the year 123. The night of Con's birthday were discovered 5 principal roads leading to Tallaght, which were never observed till then, and it gives the names. And we'll come through a lot of these again later. So, instead of building Roman roads as they did through Europe, somebody clicked their finger and suddenly we had 5 miraculous roads built in Ireland. All of these roads relate to royal sites. These roads weren't put anywhere. They were significant. And every kingdom had its royal site. Every province, the 5 provinces, had their particularly large royal sites. And these royal sites were used for a variety of reasons. The one on the left obviously is Tara, the one on the right is Dolan. I don't know how many of you have been to Dolan beside Kilcullen. You can see it quite well from Old Kilcullen, the deserted village, but the one that has the beautiful remains of the old church site. And Irish laws were peculiar at the time. Travel was restricted to your own tour. You couldn't go from Tipperary across to Carlow. You couldn't go from Kildare to Dublin. You could travel within your own tour, but only the elite could travel outside their tour, and then with permission, and then following a whole series of rules that were laid down in the Brehon Laws. And again, we'll come to some of those. And there were regular visits done internally within a tour on a regular basis for a whole variety of reasons. And when the king travelled, he travelled with a retinue. And if he got tired early, he stopped off at somebody's ring fort and said, "You're looking after me for tonight." And the junior king who was in that ring fort said, "God, I have to go out now and feed this lot, get them booze and put them on the road tomorrow morning." And there was a whole structure around feasting and festivities that we wouldn't have seen before. But they're all recorded. The ordinary people, as we know in this early period, were slaves. Male slaves and female slaves. The elite were the royal families, and then the professionals like the brev and the poet and the lawyer and the rest of them. Now, we'll come to chariots in a minute. There's lots of documentation about the use of chariots. Maybe it's the next slide. Yes. If you read Turnbo Kulnya, you'll see that nobody travels anywhere unless they're on a chariot. People get slaughtered on chariots and by chariots. But we've never found one archaeologically. The nearest chariots found in Ireland, to Ireland, have been found in Yorkshire, where chariots were buried with the king of whatever region. And there's only about half a dozen chariot burials in England, in Great Britain. But those are in Yorkshire, north of England. The drawing on the right-hand side is from the High Cross in Clonmacnoise. So they knew about chariots, but the wood they were made from was usually very light wood, very responsive wood. You didn't want to go into battle on a wagon with 4 wheels and pretend you were on a tank going at 80 miles an hour. No, the chariot was light, and therefore the wood didn't survive in the records. What has survived, bottom photograph, are large wooden wheels, like the wheels that they used in the old days to take stone down from the mountains around here and bring them into Dublin so they could build George in Dublin. These wheels have survived, and there are also bits and pieces of horse harness and things like that have survived through the times. The king had assemblies, and a variety of different assemblies, and I'll go through some of these in later slides, but the one we would have all learnt about in school would have been the Enoch, the fair day, which was celebration, having a party, and the poets writing long recitations to the power of the king. But there are also visitations by the king and the poets, where the poets themselves got together and they could say, well, I have a great poem that I gave to my king, and he gave me 3 horses as a bonus. And one of the guys would have said, well, give me the last 3 verses and I'll copy it in next time I'm talking to my king. The Eruct was for dispensing justice, promulgating new laws, working out boundary issues between different farmers. And that was held primarily by the brehons, but the king was responsible. His decision was final. And the last one was the coin. Now, coin is tax, okay? And they all levied tax, and the tax was a portion of what you saved after the harvest every year. And there are a whole lot of areas across Ireland that are regarded as assembly points, and obviously the main one we all know about is Tallaght. There's a variety of ways it's been spelt in the old books, but this was party time, usually held in the autumn when the harvest was in, and full of games. And the second last line there's a story in one of the annals about the 5-mile tailback of chariots going to Tallaght. It sounded like the old days of trying to get through Naas when you wanted to get away for a long weekend. Then, as I said, the king went and visited the major ring forts in these Tuatha, where he looked after the guys who wanted to be king, get rid of them. He'd ensure that he was being looked after properly by some of the junior kings who might be wanting to save on how much meat they put out, because meat was very valuable, how much beer they brewed, and everything on this point of view was free. In other words, the king paid for nothing and received it all. We're now going into what do we know about the roads themselves. And there's an extensive amount of information in the old manuscripts about roads and the names they had for roads. Now, in my old Irish, I'd have used the bottom one, Boher, for everything, you know. That's how I came through school, and that's a long time ago. I would have known the word Slee, and that had been about it. The other ones I would never have come across before. But these are the major roads again, coming out of Tara and spreading north, south, and the rest are going west or southwest. And a lot was written in the law tracts about keeping the roads neat and tidy. And there's a quotation I'm going to produce in a slide or two about building a road for St. Bridget. One of the keys about these roads is that when the Vikings and the Normans were talking about Ireland, they never complained about bad roads. So the chances were that at that stage, when they arrived, the roads were in good condition. It was regarded as your duty to look after the roads, if you were a junior king or a senior king. And they had an arrangement that the big farmers lent staff out to repair the roads, depending on what they were doing. A lot of the roads were on the back of eskers, and we'll come back to that, particularly when we talk about the Schliemore that goes across to Clonmacnoise. You didn't have to worry about drainage on an esker, that's for sure. But other roads had drains on both sides of the roads. This is that quote I was talking about. They were to lay a foundation of tree branches and rocks and some very solid earthworks in the deep and virtually impassable bog and in the sodden and marshy places through which a large river ran. It could bear the weight of the charioteers and the horsemen and chariots and wagon wheels and the rushing of people and the clash of enemies on all sides. And that gives a hint as to what the roads were used for. It was used for transferring charioteers, so they could be going to war. Wagon wheels, which was trade, you might be moving grain from one part of the kingdom to the other. The rushing of people, in other words, if they were going to an Enoch, and the clash of enemies, and again the use for war. So these roads were in use all right. They're mentioned all over the place in the books. Táin Cúile mentions 15 different roads. The Tallaght Eater mentions 7. Aisling Mac Conneala mentioned 6. And they had today's problem. If you had a road frontage and wanted to put your bungalow bliss house on the road frontage, it added value to your local land. And the value was the only currency that they had in those days, the value of cows or the values of female slaves. So beside a highway leading to a monastery or a house of a lord, that field was worth 3 extra cows. Leading to a wood or a mountain, 1 cow. A cow track leading to a cattle pond, a 2-year heifer value was added. So, if you had a road on the frontage, you were made. Now this is 1500, 1600 years ago, folks. It's not just yesterday it happened. The Annals of the Four Masters has 37 roads called ballocks, a variety of them. And there's some of them. Most of them I've never heard of, I have to say. Actually, all of them I've never heard of. But place names are important. Don't forget the place names we have for locations today are pre-Christian. Those names have come down over thousands of years, probably 2,000 years, got recorded in the early documents, and they still survive today, despite some people in Kerry have over a unique town. But we won't go into that. And again, some of them relate to the Boher being a cattle track, Cossan being a footpath. Cossan is still the word today for a footpath, and that word is probably 2,000 years old. Did we have bridges? Not in the early days. We had fords. So if you wanted to cross a river, your feet were going to get wet, unless it was a really dry summer and the river had gone dry. The rest of the time you went across a river, and with a bit of luck, you only got wet up to your knees. So bridges came very, very late. And they were usually built in places where the road went into a ford and came out the other side. So they usually built their first bridges in the location of a ford. That's particularly true of Dublin. It took the arrival of the Normans to start building bridges and proper bridges. Don't forget Clonmacnoise was being serviced at that time by mainly European traffic. Most of the wine that came in for the south of Ireland and the west of Ireland, church wine, came through Clonmacnoise, and there's a bit of a tax paid as it went through. So ships were coming in from France, generally from the Loire region, and that's where the connection between Ireland and the city of Tours and St. Martin of Tours started. The bishops of, oh yes, this is really interesting writing. The bishops of Connacht, with the Archbishop Hugh O'Neishin, took their journey to come thither, and as they were passing towards Clonmacnoise with two of the co-abts are they're not abbots, they're junior abbots. The co-abts of St. Kieran there spelled the Latin way, in their company, and as they were coming to the joists or wooden bridge over the Shannon at Clonmacnoise, called Clonmacnoise, however you pronounce that. Okay, yeah, this is Rory O'Connor and the bridge at Athlone, that he might have passage to take the spoils of Meath. So he built a bridge for raiding across the Shannon and getting into Meath. The forces of Meath and Taffa came to Athlone to hinder the making of the said bridge with their king Donegal O'Muirlin, and fought with Rory O'Connor, where in the end Hugh O'Connor, Rory O'Connor's son, was so hurt, he was killed off, that he died a week later after. So the bridges were not just for commerce. And as I said to you earlier, fords are all over the country. Over hundreds of them are mentioned in the annals. But if you look at Dublin, we had two locations, two settlements in Dublin. We had the old Gaelic settlement called Áthaclia, and then we had the Norse settlement in a place called Dublin. Now they're only a couple of hundred yards away from one another, but they're two separate settlements. And the rebuilding of Dunstores there in South Great George's Street, when they got to the back of that building and started to dig towards the garden at the back of Dublin Castle, they came across more Norse settlements, and particularly Norse skeletons, burials. And the Norse guys were buried with their swords and helmets and the usual grave goods that they normally were buried in. But basically, at that time, Dublin, as we call it today, was two separate settlements, one Gaelic, one Norse. The most obvious archaeological evidence of these pre-Christian crosses are the toppers. And there's 1,600 of them all across the country. Some of them are made well, and some of them are made poorly. It's hard to know what this one is. Was it made well at one stage, and over 1,000 years it has become a bit of a shambles that it looks like today? They were used for very short periods. If you look at the archaeology.ie website and look for towers, you'll see hundreds of them, if not thousands of them. But click on the one on the map and it'll tell you no evidence remains today. At one time there was evidence of that topper that's since gone. Now, a fair few slides on this, so I'll get through them. Some of them, quite a few of you will have visited this one, required massive amount of everything, from labour to planning to wood, the type of carpentry skills that they had. And this particular one is 4,500 years old, you know, so it's been around a long time. Now you'd certainly drive a chariot across that, and you'd certainly drive a four-wheeled wagon across that, and you'd get across that bog. And again we come back to the Bridget's one, the quotation we had earlier. In this quotation they were building a topper across a bog to get to Kildare. You've seen this one a couple of slides back. The causeway of Invermore in the territory of whatever that is was made by American. 5 of the annals mention the building of the causeway of Athlone by Mael Shockley, King of Ireland, in the year 1000. More examples, but the real key for this, really interesting, is that other countries were building the same sort of thing at the same time. So top left, a topper from Lower Saxony. Right hand side, England. Bottom left, England. And the one on the right is in Germany. And here's another German example. So whereas we might think we were inventing these sort of trackways across bogs, we weren't. Now, did somebody get the idea in Germany and bring it to England, and then we copied it from England and brought it to Ireland? I've no idea. But they're roughly similar time frame in construction. So the idea was out at that time. One of the advantages of finding them is that you lift the planks and you analyse what's underneath. The first thing you get are seeds.
pollen seeds, and maybe charred seeds from, say, wheat or barley or oats that people had tried to dry on a kiln. And it gives you an indication of what was growing in the locality at that time. Was it all entirely bog at that time? Or was there scrub? Or was there wood, proper wood, like oak trees or ash trees growing in the neighbourhood at the time? The picture at the bottom, as you can see, is different pollen spores. And the insects on the bottom right-hand side are important too. Insects are dependent on their food. Depending on the type of food, you'll find a certain type of insect. And likewise, if you find the remains of an insect, you know what sort of food lived there at that time. One of the other things I mentioned earlier on was the question of hospitality. And if you know the story of Cuchulainn, where he slayed the hound of the owner of the brew, and therefore got his name Cuchulainn, it was a sort of hostel or party house. But a bit like the celebrations we talked about earlier, the hostel owner didn't charge for the food and drink and lodgings that he gave. People came with presents or gifts and paid for it that way. So the owner was obliged to provide the food, accommodation and company, and the chieftain had to give hospitality without asking questions as to name, business or destination. Now we'll talk about back to that miracle I talked about of when Conn of 100 battles was born and the 5 roads appeared miraculously. There is absolutely no unity as to where these roads started and where these roads ended. And every author claims his view of this is all perfectly right. And that's the quotation I showed you before. The Knight of Clontarf discovered 5 principal roads leading to Tara. Now at that time, Tara was the place where it was claimed the High King of Ireland lived. We never had a High King of Ireland. Historically, no king, other than perhaps Brian Boru, could ever claim that the rest of the country stood behind him and followed him. Lots of kings, particularly the O'Neill from the northern O'Neill tribe, they claimed they were high kings left, right and centre. But the tribes of Munster didn't agree. The tribes of Connacht didn't agree. They could claim all they liked. Nobody followed them. The Tara theory is that up to the Christian period and the arrival of the Vikings, the centre of Ireland was Tara. And these are the roads as we see from Tara. And the one thing I'll ask you to look at is how far these roads stretched. This is up to the importance of Dublin and the Viking. So these roads really, the only one that really went a long way was a Slievemore over to Dolan. And on this map it certainly wasn't going through Clonmacnoise. If you look below, for those of you who can see it, it went from Kinnegad to Moat Athlone and Ballinasloe, and nowhere near Clonmacnoise. If we look at the Dublin theory, you'll see that each road extends much further, and in this case the Slieve Dala does go through Clonmacnoise. So there's no unity of it. I've included the little bit of the Anglican Church of Ireland in the centre of Dublin, because that stone is supposed to be the start of the Slieve Dala. Now whether it is or it isn't is anybody's guess, but it's in there in the porch of the church today, and it is claimed it is the starting point from Dublin. And again, as I said to you on this slide, you can see that the Slievemore goes from Selbridge, Timahoe, Clonmacnoise, Ballinasloe and Clarenbidge. So there's no conformity as to where these roads start and where they end. And likewise the Slieve Cualann, some people suggest it ends the other end of Wicklow. Others reckon it goes the whole way down to Waterford. I wasn't around at the time. And these are the 3 different versions of these roads. I mean, from Derry to Dublin sounds a bit of a stretch. Certainly the places that had the major primary royal sites, like Croghan, like Dolan, like Tallaght, like Ardmachcha, these sites would have had the major roads, without a doubt. Beyond that is anybody's guess. The interesting thing is that these are all the early churches around the year 400, 500, 600. And you'll see the focus of these are all on the eastern side of Ireland, rather than stretching up north, stretching into Munster, stretching into Connaught. And this supports the theory that there were Christians in Ireland before St. Patrick, and that St. Patrick wasn't the first Christian to arrive, and that St. Patrick didn't convert the whole of the Irish to Christianity. But that's a discussion for a different day. But if you remember the lines on the map from Tara or from Dublin, these are the same areas that were covered. So those early Christian churches followed those major roadways. And a load of slides that I need to get us through. They're roughly on each of the different roads. So I'll go fairly quickly. The Escarida is obviously the major one here, and that is best recorded in this book, which I picked up in the library as I came in, A Road to the Long Ridge, a fantastic book. But it's the only one where somebody went out and said, I'll walk this route, I'll find what's mentioned in the old manuscripts, I'll take my camera out and I'll take photographs. It's the only route that anybody has extensively researched, step by step, rather than sitting at a desk and looking at old maps or whatever. An excellent read, and I recommend it to you all. Okay, that's the Escarida. I'll go through these quickly because, as I said, there is major disputes as to which of them are correct. I'll show you this one actually. This is not a major route. This is a route roughly from Athlone down to Clonmacnoise that runs side by side with the Shannon. Now, any of you who've taken the road from Athlone down to the Shannon know that 60-70% of the territory you're going through is bog. Today it's bog. What was like in the early church period is anybody's guess. But they were doing excavations in a little parish called Broomhill some years ago, and they found a road, and it confused them because it was made up of 3 layers. The top layer had stones embedded in boulder clay. The middle layer had turf on top of brushwood, and the lower layer had flagstones. And you'd say to yourself, isn't that the other way around? You'd expect the flagstones to be on top rather than the lower layer. And it's dated to that early church period, between 500 and 700 AD. It was discovered by the Bord-na-Mona guys taking one of their big machines and suddenly finding that they were not digging up turf, they were digging up something else, and they went to have a look. They do that a lot because sometimes they find bog butter, or other times they find the bog body or whatever. But this one is confusing in that it doesn't follow the standard pattern of building a road in the old style that we had. So it's a bit of a confusion for anybody.
Did it extend for what?
No, it was quite short. There was elements of it. It is quite short. I think it's hundreds of meters rather than 2 or 3 miles. And again, there's bits of esker in between where people got up to the higher land, and you don't need a built road for that. You can walk straight across. Sheedala, going through these fairly quick. I always thought that was awesome for a donkey. Of course it's not. That's just my bog Irish. And this one, yeah, I can understand it going up as far as Ardmachcha for the Northern Nail royal site. But then heading off to Derry, I'm not particularly convinced about. The Slieve Coolin, the same questions is asked, well, did it ever get to Waterford? Or most of the way to Waterford? This is the book I mentioned to you. And here are some of the photographs from it. They don't come out that well. They're too pixelated. I scanned them, and I scanned them badly. And I must apologise to the author of the book because of the state the photographs are in. But they don't give a good reason. But you can see how a ridge of gravel on top of bog would be an ideal way of moving through the countryside. You could quite easily put a road route on top, no problem. And again, everybody used it, particularly the Normans when they came along. There's Clonmacnoise, another one on top of an esker. Things changed when the Vikings and the Normans arrived. When the Vikings arrived, they initially went around the coast and they raided around the coast. Was their first one in Rathlin Island? Chances are it was. Was the second one in Landhay Island? Chances are it was. We don't know, because the names that gave for these locations we can't quite trace back. But within a short period they realised we can go up the rivers. So they went up to St. Mullins and the Barrow. They went up the Shannon, Clonmacnoise. They came in the Boyne. They came in through all of the rivers. And then they moved across land to church sites, monasteries that were 20 miles from a river. And they couldn't have done that unless there was some sort of decent road. Now the Viking raids were not looking for what the Irish used to do, which was to steal cattle. The Viking raids was for what they would regard as valuables. So they're happy to take gold and silver, but the other valuable they took were female slaves. That's why Dublin became the centre, the western centre in Western Europe for the Viking slave trade right across Europe. The eastern female slave trade was built out of Kiev in the Ukraine. So there was two locations that the Vikings had for slave trades. That's highlighted a lot in the National Museum. And when Brian Boru was setting out for the Battle of Clontarf, we do know that Viking troops came across land from Limerick to Dublin to fight on his side. They didn't come around the coast. The roads were sufficient enough for a troop of men, or a couple of troops of men, to come up from Limerick and fight on his behalf. So the road system was there, and when the Normans arrived, what did they arrive with? They arrived with horseback. They arrived with knights who wore armour on top of a horse, and the roads were good enough to support that level of transport. So the roads were in good enough condition in those days. When the Normans settled down and started to build administrative systems in Ireland, as they did in time, they focused primarily on the paved initially. They had castles all over the country, but they had no real administration outside that castle. Normans had a fantastic castle in Roscrea, for example. Their influence around Roscrea was probably 3 to 5 miles. They could handily get out there and back within half a day. But the main area of influence was in the Pale, and as we know, the shape of the Pale changed regularly through time. On the other side, the Irish kept up the old Brehon laws of maintaining roads. So for a long while, and probably whatever it is, 500 years, there was two systems for maintaining roads in Ireland. The old Gaelic way under the Brehon laws, and the systems introduced by the Normans and the English for the areas that they had influence in. The Earl of Wales, and we see it for the first time, the definition of distances in Ireland. Mountains the Isle of Columbia called Tallaght. Oops, my finger's too heavy again. Which is 40 miles to the day. And from Dublin to Patrick's Hill, the Sea of Connaught, is 4 such days' journey in breadth. Now, I'm not sure if that means it takes 4 days to get from Dublin to Connaught. Maybe it was. But they did set up the grand juries. Started in 1210. They initially set up shires and then eventually counties. And each shire had a grand jury. And they had lots of administrative jobs to do, including the maintenance of the roads and to start the building of bridges, initially obviously in wood. Their main area of influence was the Pale. They had a county sheriff who got the main landholders, and from them they agreed finance and brought in rules as to how the roads were to be maintained. They had a parish organisation. They could make labour available from the big landowners. And it was generally 2 days a year, 2 days labour. A labourer came along with his tools, and the large landholder also had to produce a wagon with horses. And if needs be, he had to produce gravel and broken stone. So they had an organisation for doing the roads. And again, they did the road maintenance in the autumn and winter. And the first Act of Parliament, English Parliament, put that together was in 1555. A number of other acts followed, all from England. The most important one was in 1739, where they said, we'll build a road from market town to market town. And the landowners in between are the ones who give us the free labour and the free material. But we can raise money ourselves, taxes ourselves, to pay for the lot. But they also had to clear the drains every winter and cut the hedges. Eventually, that didn't quite work out. You had two systems still running parallel. The idea for toll roads came from the UK. They introduced an Act of Parliament in 1663, where they had a variety of charges depending on what was going down the road, and the turnpikes were introduced. The first one, as we know, was in Ireland in 1729, and it was the road from Naas, so from Dublin to Naas and then on Kilcullen. They could borrow money, make the landowners do the work, and then they would pay back the money from the people they borrowed. It didn't work out. They could never raise enough money to pay back the people who'd lent them the money. So most of these schemes failed. And here's a map from 1647 on what they thought were the road systems in Ireland. And again you'll see those blank parts. Galway Mayo, Roscommon, up north, parts of Wicklow and Wexford and Tipperary. Nothing. The second book is about turnpikes in Ireland. Again, it's in your library. Right, the first toll bridge in Ireland is that one in the bottom right hand corner. 1455. Still going strong, but nobody's charging. In these cases, they were building specific small-scale projects. As I said, the bridge over the river in Kinnegad, they budgeted for 3 arches and 3 water cuts. Other bridges followed over other rivers. The price for a coach of 6 horses was a shilling, a penny for a cart, and 1 horse and 10 pence for a score of cattle. These are the toll roads that they built over time. And I'll come to some of the maps. The toll roads always had an Act of Parliament, and these are the various Acts of Parliament in the Irish Parliament, agreeing to the road being built. And in the right hand column you can see how long the roads were: 12 miles, 30 miles, 31 miles. And this is a map of a road from Burr to Banagher. And you can see where they put the turnpike at a crossroads, where to catch people coming all directions. I'll show you some of the maps from this book in a minute or two. It's not one you'll find in the library, it's a highly prized one. Now, when they were building maps in those days, this is the map of Ireland in 1777. It's not detailed enough to pick out much, I have to tell you. And I only have an online version of it. But their view of building a map was, where are you going from? I'm going from A to B, and the bottom of the map is where you're starting from, and the top of the map was how you could travel in one day. So basically they drew a line, and regularly on the line they said, well, we're going to meet another road here, and that goes that way, and this road goes this way. So it's not a map as we normally understand it. They're all A to B maps. And up at the top, they give the distances between each of the breaks within the map. And this is a journey you're supposed to be able to do in a day on a coach. And that's how they built it up, page by page by page by page. The other thing I want to point out here is, and this is an enlargement of the same type of maps, they had names of people in their big houses. So if your carriage broke down, you knew whose big house was coming up. And you could send somebody along to get a little horse or a little cart to come down and pick you up. And you could knock on the door and say, Jimmy, will you keep me up for the night? So on the top left-hand corner, you can see the name Lynch. Right? Down here, you can see the name Lambert, Esquire. In the bottom, you can see Blake. So these people lived in these big houses. Over a bit from Blake, you can see the name Burke. And then just above him, another Burke. This is how they knew who the gentry were, where they were, and if you were in trouble, they would look after you.
What year is that?
1777, these maps. You can get this thing free on the map on the web. So I found that personally really interesting. Davy's over there on the right hand side in Esker House. That's the name of his house. Sorry, you'll see the words Cas and Rue. You can see it up there on the top. That's a ruined castle. The post office system then came into the road system. 1784, letters and parcels. They gave loans to the grand juries to improve the roads, but they had their own surveyors. They built their own carriages. They set up their own spots on the road where they would pull in for drink and food for horses. And they set standards where no standards existed before. The particular one they had was a gradient. The gradient couldn't be beyond a certain figure. And a road width of 52 inches between the hedges. And these are the list of the postal roads. And again, the emphasis on the eastern coast and not on the western coast. So if you were looking for a letter in Dingle or Cartersheveen, you can go and visit at this stage. Galway, Mayo don't exist. Donegal doesn't exist. Postal system 1799. 1700, a different map of the road system in Ireland. And we're coming near the end, thankfully. Shinawil.
That was a toll road at some stage.
Oh yeah?
And when that went in.
What's his name? The man who wrote the book on the roads to Tallaght.
Paddy Healy.
Paddy Healy has it all in there, Jerry, and there's a figure in my head, but I don't think it's real. I'm sorry about that. Actually, you have the book at home if you want to have a read. Toll House is there, a couple of hundred yards down from Terranure Cross itself, and it's the one with the two windows facing each direction. Yeah.
You had some books early on in the slides, including one by O'Keeffe, and you never
Mentioned that one.
mentioned any of them again.
That's right.
And that's in the library here. It's got fantastic pictures in it of what the old carriages look like. Actually, there's 2 copies of that in the library, and unfortunately, it's a local studies book.
What's the
So
title of that book, sir?
So you can't take it out.
What's the title of the book?
Thank you. Ireland's Principal Roads.
Oh, right.
And you had another one down in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. It was an OPW book,
Yeah. How did you know that?
because I was looking at the slides and I wasn't asleep.
There you go. And that's not from the library.
No, that's from you.
Any other questions, folks?
Sorry, do you know how old is the Greenhills Road? I seem to remember hearing or reading at some time that that was a very, very old road.
The original,
It's an estimate.
the original road from Dublin to Tallaght went through Green Hills, and what was the castle?
Timing.
Timing Castle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
it's much older than any of the other roads around.
yeah.
There's that Timon Road, the little lane, or the Green Hills Road you're talking about.
The same.
And the
It's
Timon
the same.
Castle is a good distance down Timon Lane.
They were
A
both
long way
two
from the Green
Eskers.
Hills Road.
There, what?
I think there were 2 Eskers. A little letter
Yeah.
showing off from the Green Hills heading
Yeah.
for time.
I've seen it on the maps. If I could get access to the internet here, I'd show you the old roads. The archaeology website have all of the Ordnance Survey maps on the various Ordnance surveys done, and they give great detail on all the roads around Tallaght. Great detail. The size and shape of Tallaght and the big houses that were around at the time.
And the,
Can I just say there's actually a maps section in the local
upstairs.
studies, no, here in the local studies.
Right.
And it'll have all the maps that include Tallaght. And also on the library website, if you go to source on the library
yeah.
website, there's a mapping site there.
Section, yeah.
So for instance, if you lived in Timon, you can click through all the maps of Timon and it'll show
Yeah.
what it looked like over
And
various
it's an
maps.
excellent part of the website.
It is.
What's
It's
that?
not always working.
just out
I won't go there.
The source website on Tallaght Library, local
Best
study
Tallaght?
source.
Any other questions?
the Ordnance Survey map site, maps.osi.ie, will not alone show you today's map, but down in the bottom right hand corner, it'll click. If you click,
You go through
it'll
the
show you
old
the
ones.
first edition.
Yeah, yeah,
That's right.
yeah. Yeah.
And that, unlike the wonderful site in
Well-
Tallaght, that's countrywide.
Yeah, I think there's about
It is,
5
that's right.
different editions up in the archaeology.ie map.
Yeah,
There's a number of map services that show that stuff. It's all been digitised.
it's great. Yeah,
It's
you
fantastic.
can really look online. You can see
Yeah.
everything on mapping.
You mentioned that the roads were being repaired and built during winter time. Is
Yeah.
that because they were being sown down in the summer? Or
Oh yeah, farm labourers were too busy. And it was reckoned for a lot of the building, even building sheds, building houses. Most of that work was carried off season. Once the harvest was in, then that other work had to be done.
Yeah,
So-
but what about the intervening between the spring and the autumn, the summertime?
Farm labourers were
Not
too
too
busy.
busy?
They were just too busy. Yeah, they didn't have a 40-hour week.
Yeah, right.
I remember my dad was pleased when he wound up working a 5.5 day week. He was a 6 day a week man in his early work period. I mean, just times have changed. Question over here.
Show us a map of the settlements of Dublin and
Yeah.
Auckland, but you marked the Liffey as River Roarhook.
Yeah.
Never heard of that.
Lindsay, what's her name? The archaeologist.
Lindsay Simpson. But it's
Lindsay Simpson, yeah. I won't blame Lindsay for it, but that particular graphic came, I think, from one of her publications.
It was the name of the river before it got the name of the plain
Plain.
through which it runs.
Yes.
And the plain is called the Liffey Plain.
Plain. Yeah. I'm glad you remember that. Oh God, your memory's better than mine. Names and name changes is always interesting. There was no standardization on names ever, even when writing began around the year 600. I particularly chase locations in the Midlands, and there's a particular parish that I know a lot of, and I've counted 28 different ways to spell the name of that parish. So there was no standardization. As part of the Ordnance Survey done in Ireland in the early 1820s, 1830s, John O'Donovan was put in charge of helping to translate what the army engineers were hearing from the natives. And there was big rows, and part of his survey material were things called name books, where they had a name for a place or a thing or whatever. And they had to work out not what they were told by the locals, but to go back in time to say the Annals of the Four Masters, or the Annals of Clonmacnoise, or the Annals of wherever, and try and work back what did that name have originally. And that's part of the row over Doon Queen. For a time it's called A, and then for another time it's called B, and then for the third time it could be called C. And how to spell it would have varied right through the whole way. It's the whole thing on place names I find fascinating because it tells so much.
There is a source actually to place in. Sorry to be an internet bore.
loganum.ie.
loganum.ie.
Yeah.
So for instance,
So
if you put in Tallaght on loganum.ie,
You'll be very confused.
you'll get an awful lot of records.
You'll be very
Going
confused
right
as to
back to
how
your
the hell
search
Tallaght got
one.
those sort of names.
You will get loads of different spellings, etc.
If I find your roads led into and out of Tara, but if the roads were originally meant for trade, which I presume they would be, why didn't they continue right into Dublin or into here?
Dublin wasn't really much up till the arrival of the Vikings.
Yeah,
Dublin
wasn't
was-
much coastal trade, yeah.
Dublin was the clear. It was the ford where you put down wattles across the river in low tide and summertime, and you could walk across it, but it got wet. So there was a settlement on the southern, here we go again, on the south side of the river, but nothing much on the north side, because the north side was marsh. And that's why the church was given this, the north side, to turn it into proper land and eventually agricultural land. But the north side of the Liffey was marsh for a long time. Actually, the south side wasn't much better. Queen Elizabeth gave the land for Trinity College on the basis that no farmer wanted it. And today, you can go to a certain gateway in Trinity College and watch the tide come up the steps every time the tide comes in. So Trinity is still influenced by Dublin's Liffey tide. The shape of the rivers we have today is very different as it was during the ages.
Just to mention that eskers, of course, are the ancient riverbeds of rivers that flowed underneath the glaciers.
Yeah.
And they left piles.
They left the stones
bridges,
and the gravel and everything else.
The other thing
nicely
is
rounded in lots of cases.
your map of the ancient places needs another dot in South Clare to take cognizance of Marion Dowd's discoveries there.
All right.
That have pushed back the arrival of man by 2,500 years.
You're talking about the scratched bones, aren't you?
The patella.
Yes.
Yeah.
So can I ask about that? I was going to ask, that first map you had of the Megalithic times and stuff, and all the
Oh, the
places,
Mesolithic, yeah.
all the places were up on the...
Up on the northeast.
So is that the same thing all came over from Scotland?
There's many professors still writing theses as that.
Yeah.
Now, the most interesting one, sorry, I'm straying off the walls here. The most interesting research being done today is on DNA. And a lot of that is being run through Rob, what's his name, out of Trinity?
Dan Bradley.
Dan Bradley, yeah. Two recent ones were two gentlemen buried in a kist on Lambay. They looked at their ancestry through the DNA. And these guys, who I think are 5,000 years old, came from the Russian steppes. There's a skull of a lady buried in the Black Mountain in Belfast. They looked at her, and she came from what was called Anatolia. How the hell did they get from the Russian steppes to Rathlinay? How long did it take?
I believe the language, the Gaelic,
Oh, yeah,
has
yeah.
its roots in Anatolia as well, which is today Turkey. You know. The two.
That's lecture number 36.
Yeah.
I think I gave it here before, didn't I? The Irish first time. I did the Irish language, did I? Yeah. Before. Oh, yeah. So, that research, there was just 3 papers produced in the last couple of weeks, and I have them at home but haven't read it. That detail of research is going to change our whole perception on the issue of early migration and how people moved across continents. I'm not talking from Africa to Australia or from Africa to China, across to Alaska and down into the Midwest and the States. All of that stuff is going to be scientifically proven in the next 20 years.
Will it do away with the Celts?
Yes.
I'll give that lecture next month.
Several lectures.
There's a lot of very good books on the ancestry of the Celts, and I think a lot of them in the library.
It would be, yeah.
Yeah. Recent books I'm talking about that cover things like DNA.
In one of your slides, you had 5 categories of road.
Yeah.
The biggest one, Schley, was a highway.
Yeah.
And the smallest one was a cow track.
Yeah.
Boar.
Boar.
How did they become reversed?
Just
Because,
time.
I mean, Boher, when
Just-
there's a school like the roadway in Schleen.
Don't forget, the things you learnt in school as a 7 to 10 or 12-year-old.
Yes.
Today, hearing the same thing, you'll have a totally different perception of it. It is understandable that Boher has the word bow at the beginning. Okay? That tells you what it was. Cow trap. Schlee, I'm not too sure how far back that goes. And what its original meaning was. So what we perceive words are today, they would have been definitely different 1,000 years ago. And maybe 3,000 years ago, they would have been very different.
But if you're talking about two roads that were somewhat similar, you'd sort of say, well, maybe that could be a possibility. But when you're talking about two extremes being reversed,
yeah, except
where
that.
did that come?
There's a professor who died recently, what's his name? Dahi O'Cronan.
Oh, W.
O'Caran, is it?
O'Caran.
Yeah.
Donegal O'Caran.
Now, he was into these sort of definition of names in a big way, but I can't recollect anything he did on that type of comparison. I may have read it, but I've forgotten it if I have. It's amazing what old age does.
So there's 5 names for ways, like there's Schlee, Balloch, Throw.
They all meant very specific things at the time.
Languages change.
But the other thing, in Fergus Kelly's book on early Irish farming, which a lot of the rules of maintaining roads are in, Fergus made the point that a lot of the names related to the law. So the law gave a definition of the type of road. And because it was law-based, then you could base the penalties on it. So if you dumped a load of cow manure in the middle of the road, the law would decide what your punishment was. If you left a pothole, the law would decide. So the naming was tied to how they were defined in law.
I think the
Is there
boat
something in
came
Brehon law on
from
that?
Sorry?
Is there something in Brehon law on that?
Which Brehon
rules
law?
of the road or
Yeah, which Brehon law is the question. I presume early Irish farming is in the library here. Fergus Kelly's book. Yeah. You'd need to get into the belly of that to have a good read on. But there's a lot in it, in Kelly's book. It's a seriously good bit of research and study. So are the Irish women winning?
I hope so. Well,
Nobody's interested in the match. It's probably still raining out there, is it? Or maybe it's the other match you're interested in. Garmag,
I'm sure you all enjoyed the lecture, I really did. And we couldn't get you out the last day with Frank. All lectures here are all recorded and you can download them all. You can access them through our Facebook site. So anytime, and that's due to the great work of Dahi here. And in the meantime, we'd just like to say to all of you to please safe home, slán while you're there on the ancient roads of Ireland.